In this video, I wanted to cover some tools and techniques in Maya to manage large data sets. Specifically, we'll look at stand-ins, sets, and render layers, all in the context of a shot lighting build. Let's begin with the basic organization in the outliner. Cams and lights are kind of self-explanatory. Cams are where the cameras go, lights are where the lights go. But let's look at foreground assets and background stand-ins. So the idea here is that we are doing the background renders in a different scene elsewhere. In this particular example, we're doing the background renders in Unreal Engine and the foreground renders in Maya. So the foreground assets, that's where we're going to be reading in the animation caches into here. And at the moment, I just have some test spheres in here just so we can see what's going on. And the stand-ins, that's where we have the stand-in geometry that we're using for two different purposes. We have it divided up into blockers and shadow casters. Shadow casters are things that cast shadows. For example, I have the leaves here up above. I guess you can't see them right now, but they're casting the shadow onto the ground. And for the blockers, that's stuff like this little tree branch here that if the characters are behind it, it would block them. The idea of a stand-in is that it allows you to work with massive data sets. Arnold imports a proxy geometry from an external mesh at render time only, and that geometry isn't present in the scene and doesn't use any resources except for the viewport preview. And that allows rendering scenes with many millions of faces, which would otherwise basically bring Maya to its knees as far as performance goes. Now we're going to be needing to make a number of changes in how these stand-ins render. You could make the changes on each individual stand-in, of course, but what we want to do is harness the power of sets to make these adjustments to a whole bunch of stand-ins all at once. Now, before we dive in, if you're following along, let me give you a heads up. Sets can be pretty unintuitive to work with, and there's lots of things that can go wrong. So in what follows, I've kept the mistakes in the video, using them as an opportunity to dive into understanding how sets work. So you can first watch that part, and with that understanding, follow the step-by-step that follows. I've also marked these in the chapters as understanding sets and sets step by step so that you can easily refer back to either part. I'm going to make two sets, one for the blockers and one for the casters. So I'm just going to come up into here and say set, and then I'll make one for the casters. Then I'll expand these out. And it didn't work. What we need to do actually is, for one thing, it didn't load in these things at all. And another thing is that even if I took these here, these stand-ins, and read them into this group, this would actually not work because this is the transform, and what I need in here is the shape node. So I need to come into here, turn on shapes, and there we go. And the way that you get things out of here is you just kind of drag it outside, and then it just sort of deassociates it. So let me read in these shape nodes into this guy here. And then rename these. So the first thing I want to do is come into the stand-in, look in the render stats, and we want to disable all of this visible stuff, but we want to do it on the set rather than here. So I come into my first set and go under Arnold and I go to add, and then I'm going to just search for visible, hit enter, and here we've got visible in reflections and visible in refractions. And you'll notice that we don't see that here. This actually, oddly enough, here under the extra attributes. Now, I don't see these bottom three here, so let's take out this search and expand this up. Yeah, so it's here under AI, visible and diffused reflections. So I believe that we actually need to pick all of these guys here rather than the thing I picked before. So I'm just going to click add. So I'm going to just undo that. Just reload this in here. Here we go. And these guys now are under the Arnold attributes. And I want those to all be off. Now let's give that a render now. And I'll save this image so we can come back and compare it. So now, interestingly, that didn't work because I disabled it here and it all goes black, but it wasn't taking from before. All right, check this out. If I expand these guys here, then you can see that we have here the two stand-in sets that I made, and then there's this default one here. So if I come into the set members for this stand-in blocker here and say select set members, it selects them also in this set, and so we're getting this conflicting membership here. And so perhaps there's another way to do this, but this definitely works. You take these out of this set, and now we have them only defined here and not double defined in a parallel set. And now if I click on render, you'll see that this red reflections from the outer geometry here, and it's reflecting in here. We don't want it to, so we render it out, and now it's all rendering out black. Not quite what we want, but we're getting there. So now our overrides are all working here, and we need to do another thing here is I need to come up into the light linking. So relationship editor, light linking, light centric, and I come into my lights, and I need to make it that my sky dome light does not affect any of my stand-ins. So I click into here, and it looks like I actually need to add in the transform node into here as well, which is interesting. So let's do that. There. And if I now come into here, I can deselect these guys. And it's interesting because we need to have the shape nodes in here for the overrides to work on the set, but we need to have the transform nodes in here for the light linking to be able to see it. Otherwise, the light linking doesn't know what the heck a stand-in is and can't find it. So it has to be inside of a set for the light linker to see it. And apparently it has to be the transform node in that set. And now if I re-render, you can see that we have our HDR sphere, everything reflecting nicely in the chrome ball, and including that we've gotten the shadow casting leaves out of the frame. And now that's everything that we're going to do globally for all of the stand-ins, but there's a couple things we want to do for each individual stand-in group. One of them is on the gobos or shadow casters, is that we want to turn off primary visibility. And I'll show you a little trick here. We can come into this guy here, and I can open up the script editor, and I turn off primary visibility here, and we see that the name of the attribute is primary visibility. And so then I can turn this back on. Let me stop my render from going interactively here. I can come back into my shadow caster set, come into here, and then just type prim as a little filter search, primary visibility, and I add that to my set. It is, because it doesn't have AI in front of it, it's going to be here under the extra attributes. And I want the primary visibility for these objects to be hidden or not visible. And that means that they're going to have an effect on the scene, but we won't be able to see them. Then the other thing that we need to do is for the blockers, we want to make them as matte objects so that they will render out black. So we're going to make it into a matte object, and for that we're going to use the same technique as before. I come into here and I'm going to open up the set editor here and find the section I want, which is under the stand-in overrides, and I need to turn on override matte and matte on all of these. And you can see here the name of this is override matte, this is AI matte. So let me turn these back off again and then come here into blockers, click on the add button and type in AIM for AI matte, and it doesn't like that. Maybe it cares about case sensitive. It does. And so I load in AI matte and then override and find override matte here. And on these, I do want to override the mattes, and I want to override AI matte. Let me then test this. And that's working as well, in that now it's rendering this out as black, and I get on my alpha just these things. I wanted to show you real quick a little bit more about what I was doing with the overrides together with the visibility overrides together with the light linking and why I was doing that. So I have here just sort of a simple test scene just to demo that, and if I render this out, I've got one light in here, a directional light, and it's casting a shadow, and we're getting reflections on the ground plane. And if I come into the sphere here and come into the Arnold section here and turn off specular reflection, it disappears. This is what we were doing. We were turning off these different visibility toggles here, and we had turned off a bunch of other ones as well. The reasons we were turning those off is because we didn't really want it to calculate that from our blocker objects and gobos, because it just takes render time, and so we just turn them all off just to speed things up. But the one we really cared about was turning off the reflections, so it's not reflecting, because we want our reflections to be coming from our dome environment light. And so we turn that off and it works fine. What doesn't work fine though is if I have a dome light in the scene. And you'll see that I get now this little gray black hole here, something peculiar about a dome light that is not like the other lights. If I come in here and I make, for example, a area light, again, no reflections, and again, no reflection coming in from this point light. It's only when I turn on the skylight that I get this problem. I don't know if that's by design or not. Don't really understand. Tell you what, you can tell me in the comments if you know why it's doing this, but we definitely don't want it to do this, and that's why we're going into the light linker, making the sky dome light not affect these objects, and then that solves our problem. All right, with all of that under our belt, now let's just come back in and look at how to do this in the exact right way. So I have here in the scene two stand-ins, one of a car, one of a robot. You can see them here displayed as just bounding box, and of course you can come into here and display it any way you like. So for example, I can put it into shaded mode or keep it in bounding box, or you can do per object bounding box if you like. And what we want to do is, first of all, we need to add the transform and the shape to a set. So let's come into here. I come into here and I've got shape nodes on, and I select both the transform and the shape node, and then I can right click sets and create set, and let's name this set robot. Whoops, I forgot to name that. Set car. Again, the reason we're doing this is we need the transform for the light linking, and we need the shapes for the overrides. Next up, we need to come into the default stand-in set, and we need to take these guys and pull them out so that we don't get any conflicts between the sets with duplicate members. Next, we need to look in the script editor to confirm that we're putting in the right names for the stuff. So I come in, say, for example, to here on the robot, and I want to toggle the specular reflection. So I do that. I see that it's working here as expected. Or I come in here and I say I want to turn off cast shadows. I see that that's working as expected. Then I come into my script editor and I look at the names of those things, and they are this one here, AI visible and specular reflection, and this one without the AI, just cast shadows. So I then can come into my set, add, and I can look for specifically that thing. So I use the filter, type in AI, find AI visible in specular reflection, and add that into here, and turn it off, and it goes away. And likewise, I would come into relationship editor, light linking, choose my sky dome light, come into here, and you can see it's by default it is selected. I turn it off. There I lose that error. So that's a summary of the how. Let's also do a summary of the why. So we've got these two sets, one for casters, one for blockers. And on the casters, the things that are casting shadows, so another way to say that would be a gobo, a thing that's blocking light to cast shadows on the ground. There we have these common attributes. AI visible in everything is turned off, and we have primary visibility turned off. And the reason that we want primary visibility turned off for these guys is that one of them is this here, and if I turn the shaded mode on, you'll see that it's obstructing my view at the moment, and so we don't really want that. We want to cast shadows, but we don't want to, when we're just sort of doing a test render, looking at it from a certain angle, to have it be in our way like a wall in front of our face. And so we just turn the primary visibility off so it doesn't block our view. Now that results in us seeing the leaves and the tree walls or inside of the trunk blackened in the reflections of our foreground objects. So as we've discussed before, we need to go into light linking, into the lights, and select the dome light, and then remove the transforms from the casters. So they're selected by default, and we come in here and deselect them. And now if I re-render, the leaves are gone from the sky, and the surrounding vegetation and tree trunk walls are reflecting properly in our foreground objects. Next, let's look at the blocker objects. We have the visibility turned off on these objects. We have them set to override matte and AI matte on. I'll show you why we're doing that in a second, but that's sort of the main point of these. And then additionally, we have override self shadows, AI self shadows off, and cast shadows off. And the reason for the cast shadows off is because if you look here in the relationship editor for the light linking, you'll see that we actually don't have them off here. They're not off on the light linking. The light linking for the dome light is connected to them, but because I have cast shadows off, they are not affected. If I turn cast shadows on, then you'll see that they get completely blocked and turn pitch black, which is not what we want. We want them to reflect in the foreground objects. And so the way we do that with these is we turn off cast shadows, because these objects we don't want to be casting shadows. These objects we want to be blocking the foreground objects. So if I take a foreground object and I just sort of move it back behind this blocker object and render it, you can see that it's kind of cutting it off so that it will render properly, or it'll composite properly when we put this over the background. So that's the point of making it a matte. And the point of turning off the self-shadowing is that when we later create our shadow casting layer, which we'll do in another video, we want it off there so that it is not included in the shadows. We want to get the shadows from the foreground objects. We don't want to have these blocker objects included in that shadow layer. Also, looking ahead to what we're going to be doing in a future video is we have the matte turned off, and when we do, we can actually see these blocker objects with their textures applied to them, so we can get kind of a sense of context what we're doing. So what we're going to be doing later is turning the matte on in a layer and then having these objects visible so that the lighters have context. Again, this is something that we're going to cover in the subsequent video to this one.